I was reading the New York Times best-selling motivational book, Who Moved My Cheese by Dr. Spencer Johnson, a fabled metaphor about 4 characters, 2 mice and 2 small people approach to life's maze of obstacles in search of their cheese. The cheese is the symbolism for a personal goal like money, faith, fame, love. The simplistic moral is about facing life boldly, looking fear in the eye, thinking outside the box, and adapting to change. In the forward, Corning writes, life is not straight, but a maze of passages, but always, if we have faith, God will open a door, and that will ultimately prove good for us. So it occurred to me that the Book of Ruth, which we read during the joyous holiday of Shavuot, is filled with similar mazes and incredible journeys. Since we traditionally eat sweet dairy foods like cheesecake and ice cream on Shavuot, maybe the biblical prophet Samuel should have called it Who Moved My Cheesecake, since it describes the journey of 4 characters: Naomi, Ruth, Orpah, and Boaz, and their epic transformations following obstacles that tested faith, logic, and emotions. In my book, Ruth Talk, Question and Answers on the Book of Ruth, it's published by Jonathan David Publications, I explore this powerful account of self-transformation in a easy-to-read question-answer format with lessons of kindness, humility, choices, and revelations that inspire us to improve our lives and the world in which we live. Naomi was a dutiful and spiritual wife to the wealthy and respected Elimelech, and enjoyed a great, spontaneous life in the city of Bethlehem until a terrible famine strikes there. Her husband Elimelech, like the character Ho in Dr. Johnson's book, sees the writing on the wall, anticipates change, and decided to bail on his country and fellow Jews before he loses his fortune. Just moved, and he moved his family, Naomi, and 2 teenager sons, Machlon and Kilion, to Moab, among the sworn enemies of the Israelites. So what will be the beginning of a new prosperous life, unfortunately turns out literally and symbolically to be exactly the opposite. In the Trump-like business arrangement between Elimelech and the king, the 2 sons married the king's daughters, Ruth and Orpah, even though marrying Moabite women was in defiance of the Israelites' law. Naomi did not protest, but she remained steadfast to the Jewish laws throughout the exile. and somehow taught her ways to the daughter-in-law. The text tells us that within 10 years, Elimelech loses his fortune, then loses his life, and then both sons also die, penniless and childless, leaving destitute women. Naomi, Ruth, and Orpah, 3 destitute women. Naomi, the survivalists, in a way swallows her pride, knowing, faces the fears and ridicule of those she had forsaken during the famine, decided to return to the new prosperous Beit Lechem. She tries to dissuade the 2 sisters from joining her, but the famous text of her devoted daughter-in-law Ruth insists, Ba'asher telchi elech, for whatever you go, I'll go, and whatever you sleep, I will sleep. You nation is my nation, and you God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. So will Almighty God do to me, and so He will add, I swear, that only death will separate between us. She and Ruth returned to Beit Lechem to face the fate together. Orpah, best symbolized by one of the simple mice in Dr. Johnson's version, leaves the house of her wealthy father to marry Chilion, the younger son of Naomi and Elimelech. Anticipating a posh life of wealth, instead wind up widow and penniless. When Naomi decided to return to Beit Lechem and insists that its sisters remain in their homeland and not have to endure more, which she called bitterness, Orpah gives a semi-heartfelt plea, but easily relents and returns away from Naomi with a kiss goodbye, while Ruth clings to Naomi. Orpah, in contrast to Ruth's noble character, is described as promiscuous and enters a wanton relationship that results in the birth of the famous giant Goliath, who will eventually be taken by a stone and beheaded by David, the great-grandson of Ruth and the future king of Israel. Boaz was the elder and kindly relative of Elimelech. Maybe Boaz can best be described as someone who, quote-unquote, smell the cheese often, so you know when it's getting old. Boaz could easily have rejected the return Naomi, chastising her for abandoning her people. Instead, he comforts her and her young daughter-in-law Ruth, allowing Ruth to gather limitless sheaves of barley in his abandoned fields, and then helping her reclaim Elimelech's land. He prevents another bidder from buying the property, stating that the buyer must also marry the widow Ruth, putting a kibosh on the deal. Boaz married the modest and spiritual Ruth, and thereby saving the property and restoring Ruth to her rightful place. As the introductory poem of Dr. Johnson's book says, Remember, God will open a door that will ultimately prove good for us. The Almighty God intervened and miraculously rewarded Ruth and the 80-plus-year-old Boaz with a beautiful baby named Oved. Oved was the father of Yishai, Jesse, who was the father of David, the second king of Israel. So Ruth, it is the kind and modest Ruth that makes the biggest transformation and the longest journey. From the house of King Eglon of Moab to the destitute widow of the older son Machlon, to converting from an idol worshipper to a fellow Jew, following her dream of worshiping the Almighty God of Naomi teachings, to having son with her second husband, the 80-plus-year-old Boaz, and becoming the great-grandmother to David HaMelech, to David, the second king of Israel. Ruth went from riches to rags, and from rags to riches. No one moved Ruth Cheesecake. Through her devotion to one God, her kindness to her mother-in-law Naomi, her purity of character and purpose, Ruth created her own cheesecake and thereby reaping a great rewards. So we read the Book of Ruth during the festival of Shavuot because it symbolizes a similar total transformation. Just as the Jewish people faced the challenges of the Exodus, being ousted from Egypt, having to navigate and circumnavigate the desert, blindly accepting to obey the commandments, and finally transforming into a cohesive nation, they also reaped the ultimate reward, the blueprint of life, the Torah. Just proving that we can have our cheesecake and eat it too. So enjoy the change. Wishing you and your families Chag Sameach, a joyous and delicious Shavuot.